Hey, welcome to another edition of Mississippi Stories. I'm your host, Marshall Ramsey. I'm the editor-at-large at Mississippi Today. Also draw cartoons as well. You can check out our great coverage of everything from COVID to state government at MississippiToday.org. You know, when I came up with the idea of Mississippi Stories, the idea was to, well, find really great storytellers here in Mississippi. Go figure of the title. And today's guest is just a fantastic storyteller, but also has fantastic stories to tell. It's a chicken or egg thing here in Mississippi, and maybe I'll bring it up just in a half second. Larry Wells, of course, is an author, and his brand new book, I guess it's not super brand new, but it's still pretty new, is In Faulkner's Shadow. It's published by the wonderful University Press here in Mississippi. And also, too, he is, of course, the longtime publisher at, let me see if I can get this right. You know, this is I'm sorry, I'm having flashbacks to high school English, but Yoknapatawpha Press. Did I get it pretty close?
Yoknapatawpha Press.
Exactly. I do know that it means slow water running through a flatland, basically.
There you go.
Yeah, so I remember that much. But anyway, Larry, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
I tell you what, I talked to you, actually, believe it or not, I talked to you on the radio yesterday, you know, and it was just such a great segment. I was like, well, I got to get him on for Mississippi Stories. Just before we get too started and deep into the book a little bit, let's just talk about you for a half second. When did you get interested in books? I mean, I can remember when my mom would take me to Gritter's Library in Marietta, Georgia, and I remember Pippi Longstockings and the Red Fern Groves, and the librarian named Judy got me in love with books. What was that time in your life when you fell in love with reading and with books?
Well, I grew up in the little town of Ozark, Alabama. At that time, maybe 7,000 to 8,000 people near Dothan, South Alabama. And we had a small county library, but it was upstairs over the State Farm Insurance office downtown. And I used to go there when I was 8 or 9 years old and cart away 5 or 6 Nancy Drew and Rover Boys, Hardy Boys, Rover Brothers mysteries. I started with the mysteries, right? And then I graduated. The librarian was Alice Dowdy, and Alice Dowdy took me in hand because I was one of her little pests there at the library, and began to get me to read Dickens and Mark Twain and the Leatherstocking Tales. And she got me on a reading program very early. Yeah, I won a 4-H club writing contest when I was 10 years old.
Wow. And
it was the same summer that I had fall that I had played as the guest soloist on trumpet with the U.S. Army 98th Army Band out at Fort Rucker. My teacher was from Mississippi. His name was Robert McKee from Picayune, and he went to Southern Mississippi and majored in music, and he got drafted. The year was 1951. And he saw me playing at church, the Methodist church, where my mother was organist, in a little Tom Thumb quartet. My sister played fiddle, and we had another violinist and a cellist who were both 7 and 8 years old, and I was 8 playing trumpet. That was our quartet. He saw me playing, went up to her in his uniform. He had come in from the base to go to church, and asked my mother if he could teach me trumpet lessons. He wanted to teach me for nothing, but she paid him. He taught me for 2 years, and within probably 6 weeks, he had me hitting high G above high C.
Wow.
Which is pretty powerful for a little tiny guy. And mother bought me a box Stradivarius at a pawn shop in Montgomery. This is more detailed than our listeners need, but I have to tell you that I was taught after Robert McKee, my next trumpet teacher at Fort Rucker was, get this, Lyle Babcock, the Ole Miss band director, who was unhappy to be called up into the Army as a reservist during the Korean conflict. That's how old I am. And he was my trumpet teacher. And I look back on that and I take that as an omen that I was meant to come to Oxford.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, and I think about that too. My first grade teacher was from Mississippi. I mean, and I was in Georgia. And I mean, I think about all the little things that kind of maybe said I was going to end up here too. But at that
Yeah,
time, I mean, you were like, well, I'm going to go to the University of Alabama. I'm going to be hanging out here. So you had no idea at that
no
age
idea.
you were going to be here.
No idea, but it was the best decision I ever made was to go to Ole Miss for the doctorate.
You know,
Yeah, I was recruited. I was teaching at Murray State University at the time.
yeah.
I had a master's from the University of Alabama, and Dr. Boswell, George Boswell, would go up and recruit the what they call the Ohio Valley Conference schools, like Austin P and East Tennessee and Murray State, and so he was after me for about 2 or 3 years, and finally I agreed to give Ole Miss a look. Now I drove in here in 1970 to look at the campus and the town, and Faulkner had only been dead for 8 years. And as I'm driving in, I've read Faulkner some. I hadn't read a lot of Faulkner, but I had read him, and I thought those hills between Holly Springs and Oxford were totally bare of agriculture. It was nothing but forest, pretty scraggly, little hilltop cabins, and that's it. And the road curved about 1,000 times on the way between Holly Springs. It was a little narrow 2-lane highway, and I said, "Uh-oh, this is Snopes country." And then I get to Oxford, and I'm coming down North Lamar, and there is the courthouse framed by oak trees in the distance, and all of these luxurious old antebellum houses. And I said, "Wow, which one is Bayard Sartorus's house? John Sartorus, where did they live? This is it. Faulkner and the Sartoruses and the Snopeses. This is it." And Faulkner didn't make it up.
Yeah.
So I was charmed, and I was pretty much blown away by Oxford. And I made the decision to move here, and it was the best decision I ever made.
You know, it's funny because I mean, I was out in San Diego before I was here, and I got a call from my former editor who went to Ole Miss, a guy named Dan Turner. And Dan called me up one day and he said, "Yeah, the cartooning job's open in Mississippi." And I was like, "Yeah, that's nice. The number you have reached has been disconnected." And I was like, "I'm out in San Diego. You know, it's 74 degrees all the time." But I remember coming out here and I kept thinking, "Oh, I'll be in Mississippi for 2 years." You know, I didn't think I'd be here that long. And it was the best move I ever made in my life, you know, because when you're a cartoonist or a writer or anybody creative, obviously this is heaven because you have plenty of material. But you had come to teach, and I'm just trying to think in my mind what Oxford looked like in 1970, because I mean, granted, Oxford's not a big town now, but this had a lot of development in the last, 15 years. You know, you kind of painted the picture of it looking like a Faulkner novel, which I guess it did, but
it did.
Yeah. Tell us.
It didn't have all the development, no condos, the houses. Lisa Howarth, who is the wife of Richard Howarth, Square Books, did her master's thesis on the architectural integrity of the city of Oxford, which we don't have anymore, by the way. But it was cottage architecture. The houses had big porches. They were small, mostly brick, but with a porch that ran the width of the house. Everyone had a roofed porch, right?
Yeah.
That was pretty much what all the houses looked like. And between the square and the campus, and the only sound you could hear at night was there was a pump in the ice plant that would come on when the thermostat turned that motor on, and the motor would start. I guess it was an electric motor, but it sounded like it was gasoline powered, and it would go bump, 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 and it would come into full RPM, and you would hear that for a while, and then it would stop, and it would be completely silent. That was it. There were no bars. Finally, Oxford had a little tiny bar in the Holiday Inn, but I really enjoyed reading about William Faulkner coming up to the Gathright Reed drugstore every night around 8 o'clock. He would walk up there, and it was the only place open on the square. 1950s.
Yeah.
only place he could go and that maybe see somebody. And they had a lending library, which was paperbacks, and Faulkner would peruse the books in the circuit, in the spinning book rack, right? And when he checked out a book, there was maybe a librarian or a faculty member from Ole Miss who found out Faulkner would come there, and this guy would go, and if Faulkner checked it out, he would sign his name in the library card.
Wow.
In the drugstore. This guy would steal the cards and hope to sell them later, sell Faulkner's signature, right? And so Jerry Hopkins, Dr. Jerry Hopkins later was a pharmacist then, and he saw what was happening, and it incensed him so much that he signed William Faulkner himself in every library card, filled it up with the name William Faulkner. to foil the would-be collector, that was funny. But anyway, Faulkner would have loved the square books. The square books changed Oxford so much. It came in 1977, and that and the Faulkner Conference at Ole Miss were the two big first events and locations that drew attention to Oxford as a city on the move after Faulkner's death.
Yeah.
It celebrated Faulkner's world and his writing, but also it brought in a lot of other writers and scholars who pretty much then went home and publicized Oxford, and Oxford was taking off as a cultural center then in the 70s.
I think about Malcolm Gladwell, and he's talking about the people that made his book on basically connections and so forth, making connections. And I think bringing in Willie Morris, and Willie, Willie's one of those kind of people that it kind of reminds me of Sparky Reardon in the sense that Sparky has 5,000 Facebook friends and knows all 5,000 people and when their birthday is. There are people that have got this gift of knowing everybody, and Willie was one of those people. And when you bring Willie into Oxford, then suddenly everybody wants to come into Oxford to have a drink with Willie. Yeah,
he was the social animal, non-pareil.
Yeah.
Willie was living in Bridgehampton in 1978 when the Greenwood Arts Festival invited him to be guest speaker in the spring of 78. And at that point in his life, he was ready to move back home, but he wasn't sure if he could stand the slow pace. He was used to New York. And so we met him there at Bill and Mary Jane Whittington's home there in Greenwood, and the lawn party. I mentioned this the other day on the podcast. Willie's first words to us after we said hello were, "Would you please stand between me and those little old blue-haired ladies? They're about to ask me to speak to their book club, and I know that look." And indeed, the ladies were eyeing Willie, and they were edging closer, in predatory fashion. And that's when we became Willie's honor guard, Dean and I. And it wasn't long before he sent us to see Porter Fortune, the chancellor at Ole Miss, and Robert Kayab, who was vice president of the university affairs, to see if Ole Miss would be interested in having him as a writer in residence. And they were, but they didn't have the money for his salary. It was 1979, and Ole Miss, they could have raised the money, but they didn't have time. By that time, it was maybe the fall of 79, and they couldn't invite him until the money was in the bank. So we went to the banks, and they gave $2,000 each in Oxford, First National Bank and Bank of Oxford. Then we went to Mississippi Chemical in Yazoo City. Mm-hmm. And when I told him that the banks in Oxford gave $2,000, the director said, "Oh, we'll make that $3,000." So we were on our way to raising the money, and we did raise most of it. And the university kicked in the rest. And so Willie was all set, and he comes rolling in on New Year's Eve, 1979, January 31st, with his son David, and we were ready for him. Dean and I had fixed up a house out on Faculty Row for him and put furniture in it, furnished it. She and friends made up the beds, and I laid a fire. I went out and I noticed the former owner of the house had left his firewood stacked. So I thought, well, being an old Boy Scout, I could set the fire for Willie. And we had the obligatory bottle of Jack Daniel.
Of course.
Yeah. So Willie, if I had known that he kept his phone in the fridge, I would have put the telephone in the refrigerator just to make him feel at home.
Okay, let's
but
pause
I
for
didn't.
a second, Larry. Why did he keep his phone in the fridge?
Well, it was partly bill collecting problems, bill collectors, and it was maybe they didn't call, but he didn't want them to, wreck his contemplation.
Yeah.
Also, he had curiosity seekers who were after him, and maybe some old girlfriends. He was not married at that time, so who knows what his. But I went and visited him up in Bridgehampton before he came to Oxford, and I got to know his routine. We would go to the bar, and people would by midnight, people had gone home. But Willie wanted to stay up at least 2 more hours. And so the bartender's name was Cal Calabrese. And Cal had spent many solitary nights with Willie, just the two of them talking. And Willie tipped handsomely for that privilege of hanging out with Cal, because Willie was a night owl. People don't realize how that impacted not only his schedule, but everybody in Oxford who hung out with him. Several of the professors' wives threatened to divorce them for spending the night at Willie's so often. And they said, well, if I come home, I'm going to get a DUI. And they said, risk it. I want to see you in bed next to me. And one of them did get a DUI. So anyway, Willie impacted Oxford's nightlife, but he loved it. He loved it. The only thing he didn't like was that the bars and the restaurants closed, stopped serving at 10. But if he could slide in there at 9:45, I've seen waiters giving each other $20 to not have to wait his table. Hey, he's coming. They would wait to see which table he chose with horror on their faces, because let's say there was 2 rows of tables, and the one he chose, just by chance, just by whim, would impact their evening. They all were ready to go home, right? Or they had a date or something. And they would be changing money. I didn't actually know about the changing money until years later. They were telling me, oh my God, we saw Willie coming, and we were begging the other guy to take my place. But Willie he became the Toastmaster of Oxford immediately. Everybody at every restaurant, if they were celebrating a wedding or a wedding announcement, they would holler at Willie, come over here, Willie. And Willie would drift over to their table. And if they wanted a toast to the bride and groom to be sitting at the table, he was ready. He could toast somebody in his sleep. Dean and I called him the Toastmaster General of Mississippi.
Larry, I met him a couple times. I've never met anybody that could make you feel 10 feet tall quite like he could. I loved talking to him, and I'd ask him questions and everything else, because when I got the job here, my boss gave me a copy of North Toward Home. That was my parting gift from San Diego to Mississippi. She said, you're gonna need to understand Mississippi, and this is probably a very good place to start with Willie Morris. And so she knew of Willie, and she loved Willie's work and on that. But it was just he just really did. And there's so many of my former coworkers at the Clarion Ledger had him in class when they were at Ole Miss, and they just would go on for hours. What an amazing teacher he was too.
Yeah. He impacted many lives at Oxford. He was teaching at Ole Miss for 10 years, and I don't know how many students he taught, let's say 100 a year or something. And in those 10 years, that's 1,000. And every one of those was enriched by his presence and his counsel. And really would, when he first came, he taught in the English department. And he taught 6 or 8 novels by his friends. And he had his friends come in and address the class. William Styron, George Plimpton, John Knowles, who wrote a separate piece, Gloria Jones, who was the widow of James Jones, and she talked about From Here to Eternity, and Winston Groom, who hadn't written Forrest Gump yet, but he had written about Vietnam. And so it was one celebrity writer after another addressing the classes at Ole Miss, and they came on their own dime. Yeah. And it was stunning. It was stunning. I saw students running to the class as if they were running to a football game. They didn't want to be left out. And by the way, people crashed that class, and professors sat in the aisles. Every class, professors were sitting in the aisles because the students had the seats. Bishop Hall Auditorium held 250. It overflowed every class. Stunning. Nothing like that had ever happened. He was the first writer in residence at the University of Mississippi. It wasn't the novelty of having a writer in residence. It was because the first one was Willie. And Willie brought everything you could want from a writer. He had all the New York panache, and he had the celebrityhood and the glamour, but he also had this deep understanding of Mississippi and the Mississippi roots. When I started teaching at Ole Miss, the first thing I noticed was, oh my God, they're all kin to each other. They were
2 degrees of separation.
Yeah. And that was 1970, and Mississippi was still wonderfully contained as a state. It still had its max personality, and everybody knew everybody, and it was. I had never seen a school that was one big family. Yeah. Literally, and so that was part of its strength, and maybe to a certain extent part of a weakness too, because of the provincial aspect of it. But when you think about what Faulkner did with Yoknapatawpha County and his different clans and different strata of society who were all enmeshed, they were like one big family. They were the Yoknapatawpha family. Yeah. And after Dean and I began to publish Willie at Yoknapatawpha Press, he called us the Yoknapatawpha family. So Willie was I just can't overstate his impact on Ole Miss. People still talk about it. Oh, his students live in town now. They're in their 60s, right? And they love him, and they feel that they are immensely more prepared and better prepared for life, because whether they're in teaching or writing or whatever, some of them are lawyers, some are doctors, but Willie left his stamp on them.
Speaking of family, and you've mentioned Dean several times, and of course, she's obviously a heart of the book. But Dean Faulkner Wells, obviously, your wife for many, many years. You guys met, I guess, in 1970 when you started teaching and she was teaching. I loved her first words to you. They were very romantic.
Oh yeah, well, as I say in the book, they came from those matchmakers, drunk in white, the grammarians. Yeah. She said, "What is the participle?" Yeah. Now she had been in Chaucer class with me an hour before that, and we had already sort of met. We had heard each other's names called in the roll, but everybody knew that William Faulkner's niece had enrolled. Everybody was curious about her. Now she had been an Air Force wife for 13 years before she and her husband separated, and she had never taught before. In fact, she said, the only thing I've ever taught is swimming. And she was such a good swimming coach. And by the way, she swam intramural at Ole Miss when she was a student there. when her husband was sent to the Panama Canal Zone, she taught swimming lessons at the base, the Air Force base there. And she turned out 6 junior Olympic gold medalists.
Wow.
And so she was a heck of a swimming coach, and she later became a heck of an English teacher too. She was such a good English teacher that the freshman law students wanted to take her class. They heard about her. Now that's unusual.
Yeah.
They were already in law school, but they came back and audited her freshman English class just to say they had been in her class. So Dean had her own impact and her own effect on Oxford and Ole Miss. And when we got married, she slowly became the spokesperson for the Faulkner family, not of her own choosing, but simply because she was eloquent and she was well read, and she understood her uncle so well and was his acolyte and his best press agent. And so she emerged, evolved, let's put it that way, into the family spokesperson.
Her dad, which was William Faulkner's youngest brother,
Yeah.
Dean Faulkner, he died in a plane crash. He's a pilot. Didn't Faulkner even give him that airplane? I mean, yeah.
He did. It was a Waco cabin cruiser, very expensive plane for those days. It had over 200 horsepower and would fly 140 miles an hour. And when you think that most small planes fly maybe 120 today,
Yeah.
140 was powerful. And one of my favorite stories about them was, of course, his little brother Dean, who was 10 years younger than he was, he bought that plane in 1938 with money that he earned from his sale of the Unvanquished to Hollywood, and he got $18,000 or maybe $19,000. And there was a dinner party one night in Oxford, and Dean was invited, even though it was grown-ups, and Dean would have been, let's see, around 18 or maybe 19. And by that time, he was a student at Ole Miss on the baseball team. And William called him Whiz. And they're sitting next to each other at dinner, and William is bored at the dinner party. So he leans over and he whispers to him, he says, "Hey, Whiz, you want to go to San Antonio?" And he was serious.
Yeah.
He was going to fly there. Let's just go out and jump in the plane and take off. And the plane was sitting at a little grass strip there near Oxford. They call it the Oxford Airport. He wasn't in the airport. But he had enough petrol to get him to the next fueling station, wherever it would be, Baton Rouge or somewhere. And off they go into the night. And I just love to think about the two of them with their faces lit up by the glow from the dashboard lights. And Dean, it both wonderfully and sadly was forever attracted like a moth to the flame. Yeah. That night, I think, and wanted to become a pilot. William got Vernon Omley of Memphis to teach him, because that was who taught William to fly. Vernon Omley, they called him Captain Vernon Omley. And he had an air show, which Faulkner began to dabble in himself. And then when Dean began to fly, they said, "I've got a poster back here in the house called the Faulkner Brothers Air Show." And Dean and William both did some stunt flying, and they took passengers for rides. And it was at a 1935 air show in Pontotoc that Dean took 3 passengers up, and the plane crashed about 10 minutes later, over Thaxton, in Thaxton, Mississippi. People who were at a church saw the plane fly over the church, and they thought that a wing had fallen off. That was one report. And it was a canvas, it was a wood framed plane with canvas and glue, canvas that had been wrapped with fabric and glued together. And that dries out and it can rip. And if you're going 90 miles an hour, the wind gets in it, it'll just flap it right off. And then you've got nothing out there to hold you up. So they may have seen the canvas falling to the ground. At any rate, the plane crashed, and Dean and I went out there when she was writing her master's thesis, which was the story of her father and his relationship with William. It's a great thesis. And the owners of the house took us out to the field where the plane crashed, and they said, we still plow up pieces of that plane.
Oh, wow.
And this was in 1974 or 75. Yeah. And they told us, one of them told me an incredible story. He said, William Faulkner came out here to claim his brother's body. And we had that body lying on the flatbed truck. No, they had taken the other three boys out, and because they were cousins and they lived there, and their families took their bodies out of the cockpit. What happened, the plane went straight down into the earth, and it drove the engine right back through the cockpit, and it decimated their bodies, right? Yeah. And Dean was totally smashed, and his body was still in there. And they said, we were waiting for the Faulkner family to come. We didn't want to touch him.
Yeah.
And William's first words, told to me by this guy who was a boy when it happened, and he heard William's first reaction when he saw Dean's body. And William said, Dean, is that you?
Oh.
Yeah.
That's a heartbreak.
It is a heartbreaking story. And so Dean grew up as a little girl. Death was like a companion to her. And she appreciated everybody and everything. And she was like her father. She was athletic, and she loved company and people. She was very outgoing. And she looked like a cross between William and his mother, but she had brown eyes like William. And Maud Faulkner had blue eyes. So there weren't many brown-eyed people in the Faulkner family. And Dean and I, over the years, we met Faulkner's three main mistresses. Okay, Joan Williams, Meta Carpenter, and Jean Stein. And Jean Stein was the 19-year-old in Paris in 1955 who interviewed him for Paris Review, right? That's when she said, do you believe in reincarnation? Which was probably a George Plimpton question that he put in. He was the editor, Paris Review. And Faulkner said, well, if I did believe in reincarnation, I think I would come back as a buzzard because they're protected by law and they can eat anything. It's a famous interview. So that was Gene Stein, and he was 58 at the time. And they got together. Then there was Meta Carpenter, who was his mistress in Hollywood beginning in 1932. A big threat to Estelle until Jill was born in 1933, and that was the death knell for that relationship, because Faulkner was totally infatuated with his little baby girl, and he was not about to leave Estelle for Meta. And the other one was Joan Williams, who was from Memphis, and she was a writing student, and she worked with William on her book. She wanted him to help her get her books published, her writing. And I've got a funny story about them that Dean has in her book, Every Day by the Sun. And her mother told her that Estelle decided she would confront Joan Williams in Memphis at the Peabody Hotel. She called her to have lunch with her. Now, Joan is terrifying. She's got to face William Faulkner's wife, who's going to maybe punch her. She doesn't know what she's going to do. And so Louise went with her, and she said they had a very quiet and mostly silent luncheon. I can't imagine how that was wearing on Joan's nerves. And finally, Estelle told her in no uncertain terms, stay away from William, stay away from Bill. And Joan more or less agreed. But that was the beginning of the end of that affair. But the thing about when Dean met each of these mistresses, with her dark eyes and her face with its low hairline and her dark eyebrows, she looked so much like William that each of them burst into tears. That's
Wow.
the first thing the three of them did. We met Maida in Hollywood, we met Gene Stein in New York, and we met Joan Williams in Memphis. And each of them, before saying a word, burst into tears. And I think that's because they saw in Dean, who was still young compared to them, the child they might have had with William.
Yeah.
Because she looked so much like him. And she was his presence. Dean evoked William Faulkner. And for a lot of people, her presence in Oxford was a great comfort to people in Oxford, because as long as she was alive and speaking for Pappy, then he still had existed, let's say, through her. He lived through Dean for them. And that was a marvelous trait that she had, and that was her main contribution, I think, here.
Well, Dean had I think it's safe to say Dean had a better relationship with Oxford than William Faulkner had.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Dean, when we started the Faux Faulkner contest, which was a Faulkner parody contest,
which was brilliant, by the way. That's a great idea.
Thanks. It lasted 16 years and was published by American Airlines magazine and later United Airlines magazine. It was their cover story every year. Yeah. And in July, we had the winner read his winning entry at the Faulkner conference at Ole Miss. And one year, because we talked the magazine into bringing back the imitation Hemingway contest. In fact, we wouldn't have started Faux Faulkner if Hemingway hadn't closed. The imitation International Hemingway contest ceased to be. They closed it down in the year something like 1999, and the next year, 2000, we started the Faux Faulkner, and we said, Pappy is picking up Papa's fallen banner. All right, Pappy and Papa. Well, the editor of American Way, Doug Crichton, got an irate letter from a Hemingway fan saying, you're just imitating our contest. And so he writes him back in the next issue, yes, but isn't imitation the sincerest form of flattery? And so we said, shoot, just ask the Hemingway people to come back and bring their contests back and publish them both in the same issue.
Yeah.
And they did. And the next year, the cover showed Faulkner and Hemingway with their typewriters between them, and they're typing, and the typewriters are on fire. Flames are shooting up out of the typewriters as they mano a mano are writing against each other. It was so funny. And so we invited Jack Hemingway, who was his first child, his first son, known as Bumby, when he lived in Paris, to come and be a judge of the Faux Faulkner. And Hemingway invited Dean and me out to LA to help judge the International Hemingway Contest. So we swapped off, and immediately CNN was interested because it looked like the Faulkners and the Hemingways were burying the hatchet. Well, what did they have to bury the hatchet for? It happened when Faulkner was asked to attempt to speak to a class at Ole Miss. I think the year was something like 1948 or something. And he had put it off because he didn't like the fact that Ole Miss had never really celebrated him as a writer, and they fired him as postmaster. And although he wanted to quit anyway, worst postmaster they ever had. And so he agrees to attend the class if they won't have a reporter present and he won't be quoted. Do you know this story? Have you heard this story?
No, I haven't heard this one before. So.
And so the teacher didn't know that one of the students was an AP stringer. Now, he was a stringer just for the football team, but he still had those connections. Yeah. And he's taking notes, right? Somebody asked Faulkner, who are your top 5 writers in America today? And he named John Dos Passos, Ed Scott Fitzgerald, Willa Cather, and Thomas Wolfe. And he said, and myself, I'll throw myself in there. And the kid raises his hand, what about Hemingway? And Faulkner said, well, he plays his cards too close to his chest.
Oh.
And what he meant by that was that Hemingway had a really clean, economical prose that anybody could read. He was every man's writer, right? And that was one reason for his big success. Everybody talks about the fact that he was a journalist and he had an economy of style that was so readable. And Faulkner, on the other hand, is really tough to read. He plays back and forth in time. He goes in and out of the subconscious. He has you never know exactly who is speaking. In one sentence, he will have 5 different speakers sometimes. In one of his books, he had a 60-page sentence that didn't have punctuation until you got to the end. So Faulkner is definitely not your easy reader, easy read, and that's what I think he meant. He didn't mean that Hemingway lacked courage as a writer, but that's what the kid wrote down, and he sent that into the AP. Faulkner says Hemingway lacks courage, and Hemingway picked up the paper in Havana 2 days later, and it's already, the AP's got it over around the world, and everybody wants to know what Faulkner said about Hemingway. And it says in Spanish, Faulkner says Hemingway lacks courage. And so Hemingway then gets a retired brigadier general to write Faulkner an irate letter attesting to Hemingway's courage under fire in World War II. You think I lack courage? And Faulkner says, oh my God, I wasn't trying to impugn his manhood. You know, I'm not saying anything about his physical courage. I'm just talking about as making a literary comment. And I certainly would never do anything to offend him or hurt his feelings. But by that time it was too late. And Hemingway was already on his fishing boat, took his shotgun out there and started shooting seagulls, and saying, that's Dos Passos, that's F. Scott Fitzgerald, and that one, by golly, is William Faulkner. And if anybody asked him about Yoknapatawpha County, he said, oh, he's just that corncob smoking farmer from Yoknapatawpha County. Yoknapatawpha. So anyway, Jack, Faulkner, and Dean hugged at Roanoke and made up in front of the CNN cameras, caught that moment. And it was really beautiful. Of course, Faulkner and Hemingway never made up.
Yeah.
But
and I can't
in essence, Dean at that moment and Jack were the representatives of their families, and they made up and buried the hatchet.
That one of my first conversations episodes, I actually didn't do the interview. It was Bruce Livingston did the interview, but we did Ken Burns. He was in town.
Oh, really?
Interviewed Ken in Roanoke. And so that was really a lot of fun. But I have this one video, and I just thinking about when's Ken Burns going to do. He needs to do a Faulkner, series too, like he did the Hemingway, which I really enjoyed. I thought that was very well done and was enlightening. But I've got this great video of Bruce playing Faulkner's piano with Ken Burns watching him, and I was like, yeah, you just can't get any more Mississippi than that. That's about as good as you're going to get on that. But
oh yeah, that's right.
But yeah, I was just trying to think that, I mean, I'm surprised seriously that Hemingway didn't just fly up here and take a swing at him, because that sounds like something he probably would have done.
In his dreams.
Yeah, I know. I think Faulkner would have swung right back on that. Dean, like I said, Dean was a wonderful writer, and Every Day in the Sun was it was a beautiful book. I mean, I probably, read it long after it came out. And, I mean, my mom had COPD. I know she had COPD, and it's one of those things, when you're diagnosed with it, it's like, okay, I gotta take care of a few things. She jumped right on it and started working on that book at that point, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. And she did a beautiful job with that. I'll tell you a funny story about when the book came out. It was published by a division of Random House, Crown Publishing Group.
Yeah, wow.
And Richard Howarth and Lisa decided to launch the book at the Lyric Theater, where Intruder in the Dust had premiered. And Dean is a little girl. Well, she was 13 in 1949 when the movie came out. And the family went, William went, and so they said, we'll return Dean to the scene of the premiere of Intruder in the Dust. The Lyric Theater is now, of course, a venue for big events, and they do have some concerts in there, but it seated 400 people, and Dean was very nervous about she was shy when it came to public speaking. I think when she saw that William Faulkner was mumbled the Nobel Prize speech because he was so intimidated by the audience, that's when she developed stage fright. Wow. I think she was full of herself up to that point, but when she saw that Pappy was afraid of public speaking, she thought, well, I am too. So we were giving a cocktail party for her the night before, and we had all the writers in Oxford come over. And so I put it to them that Dean was afraid was worried about speaking before a big crowd. And so Tom Franklin says, I'll speak for her. And Lee Durkee goes along with it. Yeah, me too. And so we got Wright Thompson, Lee Durkee, Tom Franklin, Jack Pendarvis, and Ace Atkins to be her surrogates at the book signing, and go out on the stage in front of the 400 fans that are gathered. And I picked out 2 pages for each of them to read, which were really funny given their personalities. And I knew everybody in the audience knew them very well and had read them. And so Tom Franklin, Lee Durkee led off, I think. And he said, I coached them all to say, my name is Dean Faulkner Wells, and then begin to read. And so then Tom Franklin steps up and he says, that man is an imposter. I'm Dean Faulkner. And so the audience is sitting there pretty much bemused. They're not expecting this to happen, but for all these writers to come out, and they're all male, and they're pretending to be Dean. They're saying, where's Dean? And at the end, I escorted Dean up to the mic. She wouldn't go out there without me. And I escorted to the mic, and she leans forward and she says, I'm Dean. And she got a standing O right there.
Oh, that's awesome. That is awesome.
Beautiful.
I know Tom well enough that I could see him doing that, though.
Crooked letter.
Exactly. Getting, him and Beth Ann into Oxford that was a home run just for both of them. I mean, they're just.
Yeah, she took over for Barry. Yeah. From Barry, and Barry tapped her to succeed him.
Yeah.
And the program is thriving and flourishing, but their presence in Oxford has really been is part of the Renaissance. That I think of it as a Renaissance of Oxford, because the whole second wave comes in, and they all write in Faulkner's shadow. But they flourished because they are all his students.
Yeah.
Basically, everybody who writes in America or around the world are his students. By the way, the word Yoknapatawpha is a buzzword on every continent, to the intellectual elite anyway.
Yeah.
And by the way, you'll be interested in this. I'm digressing now. Faulkner himself pronounced it, according to Dean, Yoknapatawpha. Yoknapatawpha. And probably the Yoknapatawpha Indians themselves, although nobody knows, would have accented every syllable equally, which most Indians nations tend to do in their languages. Yoknapatawpha.
Yeah.
Yoknapatawpha. They wouldn't say Yoknapatawpha. I say, most people say Yoknapatawpha because Patawpha means water in Chickasaw.
Right.
And I think we naturally are going to, I don't know why we accent that second syllable, but Yokna means gentle or slow moving, slow water. And it was the Yokne River. The Yokne River, which still flows into Enid Reservoir here, you know. And the locals came in and they couldn't write the word Yoknapatawpha, so they said Yocona. That was as close as they could get, Yokona. But they pronounced it Yokne. When I first came here and I said, why did they pronounce it Yokne? It's spelled Yokona, Yocona, right? But that went back to the originals. The originals were trying to spell what they heard, and they pronounced it the way they heard it, Yokne. They didn't get to the Patawpha. They stopped at Yokna. And but Faulkner saw that word on an old watershed map, as you probably know, when he was working as a bank teller at the First National Bank, which his grandfather co-founded, and was president of. And there was an old bank account for the watershed, the Yoknapatawpha watershed district. Now that had to go back to the beginnings of the county.
Yeah.
And I don't know how the First National Bank, well, the First National Bank's opened probably in the teens or before World War I, because Faulkner was a teller there briefly and hated it. And he saw that, but he walked away with treasure in his pocket, and it was the word Yoknapatawpha.
That's always cool to see. I mean, it's always fun to talk to writers and so forth, where they get their inspiration or where they find the little bits and pieces and where they get the stories and who inspires them for characters and things like that.
Yeah.
Ask you as a writer, and you, number one, In Faulkner's Shadow has a couple different meanings. Obviously, you're talking about the writers, they're all writing in Faulkner's Shadow, and you being in the family in a way too. That had to feel, you were suddenly thrown into this very famous family, but also a very fascinating family and a very interesting family and so forth. What was it like for you to be part of the family?
Well, it took a while to adapt because the Faulkners tended to be combative and argumentative within the family. There was a lot of competition. The competition was who's going to stand out the way Mr. Bill did.
Yeah.
And Dean did have her cousins, Jimmy and Chookie, to contend with, but also Jill. But Jill lived in Virginia and was rather distant. But for me, Dean actually picked me out of the lineup, basically, as it were. She came up, walking up to me to say, what is a participle? Because she had already noticed that to her, I looked like Pappy. She thought that I resembled William Faulkner somehow.
Yeah.
And it must have been my stature or my gestures or my way of speaking. I don't know what it was. I don't look like him exactly, but I did have a kind of a big nose. And so she called a friend that day in September in 1970 when we met, and she asked me what a participle was. And she said, I've just met the man I want to spend the rest of my life with. And get this, I didn't know she said it. She never told me until 2 weeks after she died. Her friend, who grew up next door to Roanoke, her name was Sandra Baker. She's Sandra Baker Moore, now lives in Denver. And she emails me and says, by the way, I've been meaning to tell you what Dean said the day she met you. Well, I was blown away because Dean had never told me. And that meant for her, it was love at first sight. And she had said several times to me over the years, you remind me of Pappy. But she never said, you reminded me of Pappy the day we met. So I think Dean was my entree, obviously, into the Faulkner family, but she and I had so much in common that I never really felt intimidated by Faulkner's presence because, after all, as you know, I told the story on your podcast, Now You're Talking, that one night when we were dating and trying to decide whether to get married, we couldn't come to a decision. We had both been divorced and both had children by our first marriage. So I go home to my apartment, and at 3 o'clock, I'm awakened by a presence in the room, and it's at my window. The window has an impression of Faulkner's face. It was as clear as a photograph, although it was leaf shadow cast by a street lamp. And I was amazed, but I was not uncomfortable with the sense that Faulkner was looking at me. In effect, he had been looking at me ever since Dean and I got together, and in my mind. And so his presence was everywhere, of course. It was everywhere in Oxford. The thing about Oxford is when you live here, you're living in two realities. You're living in a fictional reality. If you've read Faulkner,
Yeah.
he's all around you all the time, his stories and his characters. And that colors the world that you're in. And I think it gives people in Oxford a heightened awareness of and appreciation for living in Oxford, because Faulkner put layers there that wouldn't be in other towns. People, the scholars, come here already knowing Faulkner. They've already read him and they see him everywhere. And so the people in town, that's part of the Faulkner presence here, and it's never going to go away as long as people read him. So he was part of. He was the ghostly presence, let's put it that way, in the family, and our literary guiding light always. So I was never intimidated, and in fact, as you know, I put him as a character in my first novel, Rommel and the Rebel. I have Rommel coming into Mississippi. I had read an article in the Jackson Clarion Ledger about the Civil War Roundtable, and one of the ex-colonel who lived, a retired colonel living in Jackson named Jack Maxey, had read a paper about being a cadet, a second lieutenant right out of Mississippi State ROTC. And he said 5 German officers came to study the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads. And one of them, he thought, was Rommel. He thought it in retrospect after the war, where he began to put 2 and 2 together. I met Rommel's son, Manfred, later, and I interviewed him for American Airlines magazine on the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994. In his office, he was the mayor of Stuttgart, Germany. And I said, well, my first question is, was your father ever in America? And I need to know this for my own interest. And he said, no, my father was never in your country. And he explained why he was never in America. And so I figured Manfred should know. But of course, for fictional purposes, that had never held me back, because if Jack Maxey said Rommel was there, then for my purposes in the novel, he was. And later I was at Bryce's Crossroads with Barry Hannah watching a reenactment of the battle, and a Boy Scout leader came through with his scouts all in uniform, and he said, boys, this is where Erwin Rommel, the German general, the field marshal, was here. And he was here and studied the battlefield with William Faulkner. And I thought, I am not going to say a word. I made that up. And the guy is telling them this is gospel. In other words, he read the novel as history.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, good job. Fake news. You invented fake news on that. So, well, I guess technically he almost was here because his replacements in North Africa were kept prisoner of war in Jackson, out at Camp Clinton. At the prisoner of war camp.
Yeah.
Clinton. So I always thought, of course, they had their own cars and went in to go see movies and stuff like that during the war. I always thought that was fascinating. Larry, I guess as we wrap up, thank you for the book. Like I said, it's, for me, and, after getting to teach a couple of classes up at Ole Miss and getting to enjoy Oxford, and I've always loved, like I said, I've got so many friends, creative friends up there, and so thank you for the book, but also thank you for your part in attracting all the people that have come up there. And like I said, Square Books, you and what you've done and what Dean did and what the university has done. It's just always really, as being a creative and artist, and that's one of the reasons why I've stayed in Mississippi for so many years. It's just because you can't get that kind of access to that many talented people like you can here. And it's great. So I just want to say thanks for that, and thanks for the book, because the book's wonderful.
Well, thank you, but we're all lucky.
Yeah,
we're so lucky, we're so fortunate. This is a great state.
Yeah.
And this is it's a state of being and a state of mind. And it's the Faulkner heritage is still with us, and we're so fortunate to have it. It's like our comfort blanket. That's our Linus's blanket. Never leave us. We'll always have Faulkner.
Well, thank you. Well, Larry, you take care, and thank you for doing the interview with me today.
Okay, I enjoyed it, Marshall. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for watching this episode of Mississippi Stories. Make sure to subscribe to the Mississippi Today YouTube channel and click the bell to be notified every time a new video uploads.